All right, thank you. I'm not sure if I'll be able to live up to the introduction, but so as James mentioned, our group is trying to design robots you can wear on your legs that improve your mobility, especially for people with disabilities like amputation, stroke, or aging. And the main challenge that we have in designing these devices is that the human device system is so complex, especially on the human side of the system, especially on the nervous system side of the system. As we've seen in some of the talks already today, very, very complex, difficult to model systems. And that means it's very hard to predict how a person is going to respond to some new device that we give them. And I tried to stay true to the prompt that I was given by the organizers here and kind of created a whole new talk. I think that a strong implication of the complexity of the human device system is that in order to interact with it well, we need a lot of data in one way or another. And the kind of data we need is empirical, it's organism level, and it's from meaningful activities or behaviors. And I think that's true whether we're talking about developing mechanistic models of the human, trying to understand how individual groups of neurons behave and predict their behavior, or if we're trying to use sort of model-free approaches like the machine learning techniques I'll talk about a little later today. And so how do we get this large amount of data? Well, one way we can do that is to try to make collecting it easier. And so I'm going to talk about two projects that try to accomplish that. The first I've been lightly involved with. It's really led by Karen Liu and Keenan Worling, who's a PhD student, along with the OpenSim team. We've got Jen Hicks here today. And the idea here is there's a burden of processing motion capture data. As I see some people nodding, the grad students know what I'm talking about there. And so we've created a website, addbiomechanics.org, where you can upload raw marker data. And in a couple of minutes, you can download a scaled OpenSim model and inverse kinematics. We're very close to releasing the inverse dynamics version of this. And we're also working on gap filling and automatic labeling of markers. The idea here is to remove this big bottleneck that we have in this process so that we can go out and collect more data, spend more of our time collecting interesting data sets and less time processing it. And the only trick is that if you upload data, you have to agree to share it. So this system, I encourage you all to try it out. It's not officially released yet, but we've already had hundreds of laboratories use the tool to upload tens of thousands of trials. And there are now hundreds of gigabytes of data in this uniform set that I hope we can release to the community and allow everyone to learn new models or test their models on these data. But I'm interested in developing devices that assist people. And so we need a very particular kind of data to learn those models. And so we need to have people interact with exoskeletons and prosthetic limbs. And the traditional development approach for these devices is to sort of have an idea about what a person might benefit from, spend a few years making a specialized device that kind of looks like a product, and then you get a test with people eventually. And unfortunately, we can't get very much. You can't try too many different things with those pieces of hardware. So a different set of tools that is aimed at generating a large set of data are these universal device emulators. So these are, instead of trying to be a product, they leverage the laboratory setting to be versatile. So we can try lots of different ideas for assisting people without the overhead of building new hardware. And this is, you can think about it as like a virtual reality system for your legs. You think up some new device you'd like to see how people respond to, you program it in, takes you maybe hours or days, and then you get the response of the user. And a former student has commercialized these devices at Human Motion Technologies, and they're now in use in dozens of labs around the world. So this is helping us to get more data of this human device interaction type that helps us to learn about what kinds of devices people need. Another way to respond to the fact that humans are so complex is to try to be more data efficient. And how can we do that? Well, one way is to have very simple, local, and task-specific models of human device interaction. And because they're more robust and they could be trained on very small amounts of data. And you could use these for things like personalizing assistive devices during adaptation to those devices in the real world. And that's one way of thinking about what we are doing with this process we call human-in-the-loop optimization. So the big idea here is, rather than sort of guessing what a person needs from their device and then building it and trying to commercialize it, we're going to close the loop on performance here. We'll start with a human interacting with the device, and there's some aspect of performance we care about. What's the thing we really care about? Like your speed, your energy economy, balance, pain due to joint loading, just overall satisfaction. We measure that while the person's using the device, feed that back to an optimizer, and then systematically vary device behavior so as to maximize performance. And so this is kind of what it looks like in a typical application. The person puts on an exoskeleton, and then they walk or run for a few minutes while the exoskeleton assists them according to some parameter set that defines a control law. And then after a few hours of interacting with the device, the optimizer has found a set of parameters that it thinks is optimal for this person. And we've done this during walking, where we try to reduce the energy cost of walking. We've done it during where we try to maximize self-selected walking speed on a self-paced treadmill like this. And in both of those cases, we found we've been able to improve energy economy and speed by about 40% over wearing the device unpowered. So very big improvements. And if we use hip, knee, ankle devices, and we test people walking while carrying loads and uphill and all these things, we find similar improvements, about 50% reductions in energy cost and up to 5 watts per kilogram gross change in metabolic rate. So this seems to work pretty well in a lab setting, but of course we want to personalize these devices to people out in the real world. So how can we do that? Well, one of the things that we need to get rid of is the reliance on these expensive, heavy pieces of equipment that we're using to measure outcomes like energy cost. So recently we leveraged machine learning to enable us to estimate the relative energy cost of different exoskeleton conditions outside the lab. So in order to do this, first, we needed a big data set, and fortunately we have one because we've been doing these experiments with emulators and optimization in the lab, and that generated thousands of different labeled pieces of data where we know what the exoskeleton is doing and what the person's energetic response is. And then we learned a classifier based on that data set. Its job, it's local. It just takes 2 conditions and says which one probably had the lower metabolic rate associated with it. And that makes it pretty robust. And that's up here, you're in the upper right-hand corner, you're looking at the weights that we learned for these models, and all the signals that are being used are local to the exoskeleton. It's just joint angles and torques that are produced. And then we feed this into our covariance matrix adaptation evolutionary strategy. That's the genetic algorithm that we use in this case. If we compare this to optimization using direct measurement of metabolic rate through indirect respirometry in the laboratory, we get an equivalent improvement in energy cost. That's the blue and green boxes over there, the same reduction in metabolic rate in about 1/4 of the time, because we don't have to deal with the slow dynamics of oxygen levels equilibrating in your expired gases. And to our surprise, these models generalize pretty well across a wide range of behaviors. So this is walking slowly at 0.75 meters per second up to 1.75 meters per second and uphill on a 10-degree grade. And the data-driven optimization was equally effective as direct metabolic optimization. Once we know from these laboratory tests what the untethered devices need to do, then we can design. We have our task specifications for designing these wearable robots. We're really good at this. And so you can quickly make a device that is capable of applying those optimal assistance patterns in the real world, which we did. And then we implemented the data-driven optimization approach that I was telling you about and trained it while people walked around campus. This is walking around the Stanford campus. And we gave people prompts that were from a different study demonstrated that they result in different walking speeds, these ecologically relevant prompts like walk like you're walking a small dog. And then started and stopped these gait bouts in a pattern similar to what we observe for walking in the wild. So these are really very close to the kinds of walking behaviors people actually engage in normal life. And here's just a picture of our course. After we'd optimized, we validated separately. And what we found is that real-world optimized assistance reduced the cost of transport for these young, healthy adults by about 17% and increased self-selected walking speed by about 9%. And if we take that same thing and we brought it into the lab and put people on a treadmill so we could compare it to previous studies in that setting, we find about twice the improvement in energy economy of the best devices in the past. So we're really excited about this. It works. We can leverage these laboratory-based data and these tools for rapid generation of such data to make devices that actually personalize to people while they move about the real world. So what do we want to do next? So I think one of the obvious first things that we should be doing is applying these techniques to populations that really need them. So in particular, we're focusing on people who are experiencing mobility decline due to aging and people who've had a stroke. And in our laboratory, we've been performing some pilot studies with this among older adults. This is a colleague of mine who's about 90 years old. And the results have been pretty promising so far, still early stages. Another area where I think we could really benefit from input of the computational modeling community is in measures of balance and joint pain or joint loading that leads to pain. So if we can measure a thing while a person is using an exoskeleton, we can optimize it. We can make it better, assuming we've set up our problem well and we've chosen device characteristics that actually affect the outcome. But with some things like balance, it's pretty hard to measure while you're walking around. So we've been dabbling in this area and trying to characterize balanceability by quality of response to large disturbances. This is Michael Rader and Guanrong Tan. They developed this system we call it BumpEm. And if you want to use one of these in your lab, we've also published a complete set of designs and how-to videos for putting it all together and get it working so you can torture your graduate students like this a little bit. Another important area, I think, in the near future is to develop actionable models of motor learning. So what I really want is to understand how I can help people learn how to use these devices faster. And we've done just a little bit of work, of this flavor in the past where we measure people's response as they're novice users of exoskeletons, learning to use these devices. We see that it takes a long time, like hundreds of minutes, and that there are indicators of expertise like variability of stride period. But these are pretty crude, high-level, observations about what's happening. They don't tell us what new experiences we need to give users in order to help them become expert faster. And if you have ideas about how to do that, I'd love to chat about it. In the longer term future, obviously we'd like to see the holistic response people have to these kinds of devices. Like, do people walk more? Do they experience an increase in quality of life? And do they live longer because they're staying more active? In order to do that, though, we're going to need very robust, safe devices that probably require so much engineering that they need to come from a company. Okay, I tried to leave lots of time for questions and discussion. I want to thank the students that led all this work, in particular Keenan Worling, who's led our ad biomechanics work, Patrick Slade, who led our recent data-driven optimization problem, and Katie Poggensey, who led our large data collection and with ankle exoskeleton emulators in the lab. And of course, I'd like to thank the National Science Foundation for their support of this work. And just as I'm standing in this room, I happen to be an editor at Science Robotics, and the kinds of research that we're hearing about today, and seeing the posters and in talks, is perfect fit for our journal. I hope you'll submit some of this to us. Thank you.
We have about 10 minutes for questions. Would anybody like to start us off? Let me get you the microphone.
Francis. Not so much a question, but a shameless plug. I'm working on sonifying gait, so using audio distortion for music playback as an indicator of optimization. So we should talk.
Sounds good. I look forward to it.
Okay.
Hey, Steve, thanks for a great talk. I was wondering if you could just kind of sketch an overview of the status of applying these types of exoskeletons to those. There must be preliminary work that
Yes,
people have
yes.
done. And
Absolutely.
are people finding metabolic reductions, or is that a meaningful thing to patients? Those, I don't know, just those kinds of, just a kind of
Those are
general
good
sketch.
questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So let me start the last thing you asked first, and this isn't exactly what you asked, but one of the questions that comes up a lot is, are we engineers, roboticists, trying to develop tools that people don't actually want? And I think it's a very fair question. And we recently ran a survey of older adults and of clinical practitioners, asking them what they think the future of exoskeleton use will be like. And we were surprised, a very large majority of both older adults and doctors thought, I'm likely to use a device like this. We showed them some pictures of exoskeletons and asked if they thought they might use it for rehabilitation or prescribed for daily use in the next 5 years. And this is like 150 in each group. So I think there is interest in there. Now, do people care about things like fatigue? I think so. That shows up quite a bit. Now, one of the things that came out of the survey was that the feature people most wanted was reduction of joint pain. And so this is an area of active work in our group right now. But first, we need a metric. We need to be able to measure, estimate what the joint loads are associated with pain while a person's using a device, and then optimize the pattern of assistance so to drive that down. And we're still in that first stage of measuring. But I'm hopeful that we can try to address that issue as well. Now, we have tested these approaches among people with stroke. We ran into the first problem is if your device doesn't do something that can address the need. And we only assisted the ankle, and there was a problem because we didn't see the changes in coordination, the knee and hip that were needed to benefit from ankle assistance. So now we're going back and trying this again with the ankle knee device. Among older adults, we've finished an N=10. We call it preliminary data because we really need to kind of a big study, but N=10 study of older adults with, I think, an average age of 75, who all had large improvements in energy, economy, and speed with optimized ankle exoskeleton system that's in submission. Among people with amputation, we have had no luck. So I got involved in this field, 20 years ago with an interest in addressing amputation. And everything we've tried has failed. We've used optimization on a bunch of different ways of parameterizing the problem. And I'm convinced now that the problem for this population involves coordination between the person and the device. And having an open loop controller playing on the prosthesis is not going to get us to the kinds of performance enhancements that we want. And the path ahead lies with neural integration, I think, those devices. But since I don't do that, we are trying some other weird things with prosthetic limbs. For example, it was mentioned earlier, Dulce was talking about doing some overground split belt treadmill walking, and somebody nearby said, what overground split belt treadmill? How does that work? And there's these cool Nimbus shoes that have wheels on them. So one foot is rolling backwards and the other is rolling forwards. Feels like you're walking on a split belt treadmill. Well, we're doing a similar thing with prosthetic feet, where the prosthesis side rolls forwards as you're walking, and that reduces the step length and some of the moments associated with discomfort at the residual limb, and also reduces energy costs quite a bit in our pilot tests. Yeah.
Just balance. Can you talk about preventing fall? Can you talk about-
Balance.
Yeah, that because that one seems like huge and just unsolvable to me, but and especially when it's coupled with cognitive impairment, with balance. So, and I'm wondering what the landscape looks like. for
Huge
that.
and unsolvable that's my love language. That's exactly what I like to hear. So I think it's not as intractable as it might seem. So we now have a pretty good data set of people responding to a wide variety of these different perturbations. And I know there's other data sets that somebody got some Georgia Tech folks here recently published. Yeah. Hey, with like the treadmill perturbations during walking and things like that. So I think we're getting more and more information about how people do respond to these kinds of disturbances, and being able to say if it's good or not, and rank it, rate it. And we've also been developing exoskeletons that are specifically designed to assist with balance. For example, a hip exoskeleton that has adduction control, so we can help with side mediolateral foot placement. That we think is an important signal. It's a hard problem. I should have had a slide in here, but one of the fun things we've done recently in our group is we're having trouble having machines learn a model of quality of response. So we just made a bunch of animations of people walking while they get disturbed either normally, or we have these artificial impairments on them. We do use air cast boots, or we block eyes, or we put little air jets on their feet that while you're walking. So every step, it just randomly perturbs your foot. So those are artificial impairments, and we show people videos and say, which case has the artificial impairment? Is it the left or the right? And among our team, we had an average accuracy of about 90%. So there is a signal there. We just need to figure out how to extract it. And once we do that, I think I'm confident we'll be able to prove it. Now, I mean, obviously falls are a very complicated phenomena, but intrinsic balance is one of those factors that we can do. Sorry, that was a lot of talking in response to.
Hi, thank you, Steve, for this incredible talk. I'm standing here so we don't get feedback. I'll move out of your way in a second. I really like, this idea of having people walk their dog or go to the grocery store. So, I mean, I'd love to know what the results were there, but I think more importantly, we need to address, I think, a longstanding bias in our field where steady state over many steps is the way people live, right? Which is, sure, some people live that way, but have been studies even from 20, 30 years ago showing that the median number of steps in a walking bout of an adult at home is like 9 steps, right? So what I'd love to see is a transition to the home, a transition to the environment where we don't perhaps overemphasize steady state, because maybe you don't even reach steady state when you're going to the kitchen. And so, but I think you're set up to start looking at that.
Completely agree. So this is something we thought a lot about in setting up this study. And what we'd really love to do is send people home with these devices, but it raises, I mean, let's be honest, they're research prototypes, and you saw some video of this thing. You got wires hanging out every which way. They're not robust enough yet. So we did our best to try to recreate those kinds of patterns. And here you've got the bout duration histogram here, and most of the bouts consist of very few steps, actually, to try to capture exactly the phenomena you're talking about. I think of the Orendorff paper from, I think, 2008 as a nice in the wild bout duration measure. I think you're right on.